Hey everybody, Professor Snart as we get into our last week of our very quick 5-week creative writing course. And so we are now into our final workshop here, down in Unit 10, our poetry workshop. So we've just completed Unit 9, which was sort of, the bridge unit getting us into poetry as a new genre that had us looking at T.S. Eliot, very famous poet, who was interesting for a number of reasons, but not least because he was both a poet, but also a theorist of poetry. And not all poets are like critical essay writers in the way that Eliot was. I suppose every poet thinks about the theory of poetry in some way or another, but not all are necessarily so public as Eliot was about, publishing work that was not poetry, but ideas about poetry. I'm not even interested so much in Eliot's ideas about what makes good or bad poetry, so much as his ideas about the way the poetic mind works. And of course, there's lots of theories you could put forward about this. So it's not like I'm suggesting he's right and others are wrong, but his ideas really resonate with me, I guess because I feel like it sort of reflects how my creative mind works. I sort of feel like a collector of little unrelated pieces and fragments. And they don't seem to mean anything other than they have some little bit of interest. They're quirks of language, or they're an odd image, or just, there's something to them. And, many writers like literally carry around a notebook to make notes of these things, so they become quite like physical, actual fragments of pieces, or fragments of things. And it's not until that one, for whatever reason, the catalyst for the thing, gets introduced into the chemical equation or the chemical reaction, that all of a sudden all of those other fragments, or at least some of them, which otherwise seemed so disparate and just kind of randomly all over the place, they suddenly cohere into something that starts to make sense. And that really, I don't know, it really resonates with me, that idea of how the poetic mind works. So I don't think I so much read Eliot and I'm like, oh, I'm going to have that kind of mind. I think it's just that's how I was. And then I run into this poet who I admire, but also a theorist of poetry and creativity that put together like how my mind was operating in this really kind of like imaginative way. So it kind of worked for me. And then of course the other piece in the Unit 9 was that HP commercial featuring Gwen Stefani, which is sort of like its own thing, right? But it presents this theory of creativity that is just like so much like Eliot's. It caught me off guard the first time I think I just saw it on normal television years ago, and then thank goodness for YouTube collecting all this stuff, a bit like Eliot's poetic mind, I suppose, where we can go and retrieve it. So that's a really fun unit for me because it introduces an idea about creativity that I find personally like really meaningful, but I also have this like really interesting contemporary connection, which suggests like these are ongoing ideas, like how does creativity work? Not even just for poetry, but any kind of creativity. It's a pretty fascinating topic. But anyway, back to our matters at hand here. We get into our poetry workshop. So posting date is Monday, June 2nd. Feedback is Wednesday, and then that gets us into the last of our course. So the groups are a little bit bigger, not much, for this poetry workshop, largely because people are unlikely to post like a 10-page poem. You're probably posting, if it's very short, maybe you post 2 poems, but probably just the one, and then you're giving feedback. And again, it's a little more challenging because there's just not as much text there to work with, but try to be as generous with your feedback as you have been in the fuller like creative nonfiction or the short story assignment. So really get in there line by line. And I think poetry is like challenging because it's not because it's totally distant from us, because we know it in various forms, whether it's song lyrics. Most advertising takes the form of poetry, whether it's like printed on a billboard or in a magazine, or you're hearing it or sort of seeing it right on TV or whatever. Of course, there's prose connected with advertising, but usually the profound statements, the impactful statements, are framed as poetry. There's like line breaks, they exist in this visual way on the screen. They use language in an interesting way to sell us stuff, but still in an interesting way. So poetry, while it might seem kind of marginal, like who reads or writes poetry anymore, is actually in some ways kind of central. We run into it all the time. But unfortunately, those examples of poetry, particularly song lyrics, often give us really bad examples of what poetry of the kind that we're writing here is going to be. So if you think about, again, stereotypical song lyrics, what makes them good is they have very nice end rhymes, right? The perfect end rhymes. There's usually lots of repetition. They work in conjunction with the music, even if it's in a sort of contrapuntal sort of way that, you know, like they play off of each other. But it's you'd be hard pressed to take like pop music, look at the lyrics as lyrics printed on a page and say, oh, that's great poetry. Now, certainly there's some singer-songwriters who produce good lyrics that are also good poetry, but you always want to keep in mind the benefit that lyrics have in the context of music. The atmospheric delivery of the thing, the visual presentation of the thing, the music itself to help move things along or generate interest. So, in other words, if we borrow what we think makes good poetry/lyrics and present that as poetry, we often run into some of the most novice mistakes that we'll find. Simplistic rhyme, overuse of repetition, too generic or abstract. They just sort of float out there in space. There's no like actual thing going on or people happening. They're often really self-involved, which is kind of something we like about, you know, our rock and rollers, but makes for very bad poetry. It just sounds like someone's kind of whining to us. Often lyrics they are profound to us because they try to take on these grandiose subjects, which they can do maybe when they have, especially in the form of like a music video, they have that kind of over-the-top visual dynamic to them. But just as lyrics on the page, they end up being kind of like way too big, but way too empty at the same time. So if we try to reproduce that in the poetry that we're writing, we kind of end up with the same thing. Not this great, epic, philosophical thing, but just this sort of emptiness, right? It doesn't really work as poetry. So the poetry workshop is a challenging one for most people. Poetry is really like central to what we know in the form of like lyrics and that sort of thing. But that often teaches us the worst lessons about writing effective poetry. And again, just in case you're freaking out, right? I'm not grading on is this a great poem? Is this a B-level poem? I look for investment of effort and energy. Simple matters of like checking for typos is one good example of that. I look for attendance to there are rules of creative writing, right? If you're writing stuff that clearly flies in the face of what's being proposed here, that's going to have an effect in your grade. But largely it's just, did you post your work on time? And then I'm looking for the quality of the feedback. So, okay, so I'm going to pop us into, just before I close out here, our final unit. So we might as well take a look at that down toward the bottom. So this is one of those really, kind of corny endings. What did you learn in the class? There's an essay assignment, or it's framed initially as an essay assignment here, just talking about like some of the ideas you ran into that you think either have already or, because our class is so short, maybe will inform your writing going forward. And there's lots of ways to answer this basic question, of course, but the thing that I'm looking for maybe most is specifics. So if you learned about, I don't know, rhyme or emotion in poetry or creative nonfiction, whatever it happens to be, there's sort of no wrong answer for this part. But what you then have to provide me is specifics. Specifics from our classwork, from maybe the textbook you could cite, but fundamentally specifics from your own writing. So it's all still housed in Blackboard. If you want to go back to any of the old workshops or exercises we've done, you can pull those files, or discussion board posts. And really, like, you're quoting from yourself. Like, I want to see quotation from that earlier work that shows, maybe you realize you did something that wasn't effective. That could be something you learned too. So it doesn't have to be this series of great, writing moves that you've made throughout the term. It can be stuff that you realize after the fact that, oh, I did that and then saw it didn't really work. I got good feedback about it. I realized it sort of flew in the face of one of these rules of creative writing, or whatever the case might be. But you're actually quoting yourself. So that's the assignment part. You can do it as a traditional essay. That's fine. But what I think is really cool is if people wanted to do more of a video essay. You're responding to the same question here, but you're doing it in video form. So you're sort of talking to the camera in the way that I am here. You probably record yourself, of course, but you could sort of play with that as well. So what I would suggest, if you wanted to do the video option, don't just bumble through it like I often do with these. And you don't want to just write the whole essay and then read it to us. So you'd want to maybe split the difference. Make yourself a really kind of bare bones outline. So what are the things that you want to talk about? What are some of the examples that you wanted to pull from? And then speak to us about that, right? It's kind of more engaging, I think, than just having a bunch of essays. There's a requirement to respond to at least 2 other student posts. You could one of the things that you could do is maybe write this as a traditional essay, but actually do the response as a video post. There's a number of ways to do these. We don't want to get too caught up in the technical aspect of it. You can actually record directly in Blackboard. You'll see that there's that option if you have a webcam set up. I believe you need a YouTube account, but many people have that. And if you use Gmail, then you've got a YouTube account, whether you know it or not. So the video option could be for the essay itself, but just as easily could be for the response segment too. And that's pretty much it. That wraps up our course. There's a very brief survey that will open up that you can do, just kind of giving me some feedback about the course. But that's otherwise it. So we have our last workshop underway here, and then the final reflection essay or reflection video essay. All right. So as always, if you have questions or concerns, be in touch with me, and I look forward to reading everybody's poetry.